Thank you very much, Tim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. Thanks to Share Cafe for the opportunity to talk about this. If you fall asleep after this, that's okay. You've got the gist of the project. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the TECH project, we'll be importing high-grade nickel laterite ore from New Caledonia, 7-day shipping from the port of Townsville. That's from the same mines into the same port that they exported for many decades into the now shut down Queensland nickel refinery. We have nothing to do with that refinery. We use a totally different process. The only thing in common is we're getting the same ore from the same mines. We use a different process. It's called the direct nickel process. It uses nitric acid to leach the ore. Nitric acid's a great solvent for dirt, dissolves everything except the silicates, which are a nice inert residue that you can deal with. It dissolves everything else, including, of course, the nickel and cobalt. We'll process them through into a mixed hydroxide precipitate, which is saleable in its own right. It currently sells for about 90% of LME. If you don't know that, you should subscribe to Benchmark so you can get the data. We'll refine that on site using conventional nickel and cobalt refining processes directly into the high purity nickel and cobalt sulfate direct into the battery industry. The direct nickel process, we recycle the nitric acid, so it's a very low cost process. As a byproduct of that process, we don't do anything special. The iron that's in the ore, and that's 40 to 50% iron, gets converted into a high purity hematite, effectively an iron ore fines, which we will pelletize and sell directly into steelmaking. It's a premium product. The magnesium in the ore ends up as magnesium oxide. Again, we don't do anything special. It's a byproduct of the process. That's saleable, of course. The aluminium in the ore ends up as aluminium hydroxide, and that's a freed feedstock into a high purity alumina refinery, which will operate on site as well. So in summary, we've got high grade ore coming from established mines in a safe jurisdiction. We have a very clean technology process. We recycle the leach agent, so it's low cost. All of the unit operations are using off-the-shelf equipment, using standard unit operations. We have no mine, so we're very fast to market, producing directly the high purity value-add products directly into the battery supply chain. So sounds fantastic. And you might say I'm biased, and well, of course I'm biased. Everyone is biased. The real issue is which is the best bias to be biased with. And I think the bias of the world's largest lithium-ion battery producer and 2 Fortune 500 companies is perhaps a good bias to be biased with. Onto the next slide, thank you. So for many months, LG and POSCO investigated us. They undertook a thorough technical and whole of project due diligence study. That led to them investing $15 million US into the company. And accompanying that, we signed a very clean, simple binding offtake agreement for the nickel and cobalt production as nickel and cobalt sulfate. That's for about 2/3 of our production. So we've got some world-class partners, and those binding offtake agreements form a foundation for the funding of the entire project. When we first started discussions with them, they said, can you do this bigger and can you do it faster? And we said, yeah, bigger is easy. In fact, about 2.5 to 3 times bigger is the optimum size. So we increased the size accordingly. They said, can you do it faster? We said, yes, we can do it faster, but it's going to be more expensive to do the feasibility study faster. You need to have skin in the game. So we shared that risk. We raised 20 million on market. They came in with 15 million US, about 20 million Australian equivalent. So skin in the game with 2 of the world's best partners you could ask for. We also commenced a feasibility study with Hatch, a tier 1 engineering partner. But rather than my words, next slide, we'll go to the words of LG and POSCO. So as I said, you know, LG are the world's largest lithium-ion battery producer, supplying the likes of Tesla and GM and so forth. We're now part of their supply chain planning, a very good position to be in. Many of you wouldn't know much about POSCO. They are Korea's #4 company. They recently invested into First Quantum's Ravensthorpe project, 240 million into that. They're a very big nickel miner in their own right in New Caledonia and a big producer of ferronickel and nickel products into the stainless steel industry, but they're also growing in the lithium-ion battery chemicals feedstocks. So we think we've got 2 fantastic offtake partners, and that they have identified the benefits that the TECH project can bring. One of the things that attracted them were the sustainability credentials. We've heard much of that today. Next slide, thank you. Now, you can read the words yourself, but basically what the table in the middle says is that the greenhouse gas intensity of nickel production through the TECH project is around about 1/3 lower than the global average for nickel in nickel sulfate. Now that global average excludes, surprise, surprise, any Chinese production and the Chinese Indonesian production, which is substantially greater. So our greenhouse gas intensity is quite a lot lower. In fact, with the likelihood that we are sourcing gas from that is currently being vented and flared from metallurgical coal mines, we are likely to be zero or more likely to be negative greenhouse gas intensity. And that's a remarkable position to be in. That follows conventional ISO, LCA regulations and guidelines, and we've used a global company to do the LCA for us, ISO compliant. So low greenhouse gas intensity, but perhaps even more important to many nickel end users is the fact that we have no tailings. We have an inert filter cake that is being investigated for alternative uses. We produce about 0.2 tonnes per tonne of ore of that filter cake, and we may well have 0 tonnes of residue. Compare that with high pressure acid leach, which also can feed directly into the battery supply chain. That produces 1.2 to 1.4 active tonnes of tailings for disposal, and in some cases, sadly, for disposal into the ocean. So it mightn't seem logical to you, but people don't care where the nickel comes from that goes into their kitchen sink. But the end users do care where the nickel comes from that goes into their EV. Nobody wants to get into an electric VW in Frankfurt knowing that the 50 kilos of nickel in their battery pack is responsible for 5 tonnes of tailings in the ocean. So if you've got your capital right, your risk right, and you tick the sustainability boxes, investors come knocking. And that's what happened to us in relation to LG and POSCO and others that we're in discussion with. Next slide, thank you. And this just shows some of the products that came from our pilot plant campaigns that we completed earlier this year. All of that piloting was included in the LG technical reviews. The direct nickel process that we piloted had already been piloted many times before, but we undertook a couple of pilot plant campaigns on the same ore that we will be processing at commercial scale. And no surprise, we proved up the process and we produced the intermediate product that was sent to an LG refinery, which proved up the specifications. Next slide, thank you. That just shows that the pilot plant is real, or that I'm a good photographer. This pilot plant was run for a couple of months. It needed 20 operators around the clock, ran for several weeks. So we have a very good process, but just as important as a good process is to have a good location to build your processing plant. Next slide, thank you. If you're going to write a script for a good location, this effectively is the script. This location is located 40 kilometres south of the port of Townsville. There's a skilled workforce, underutilised skilled workforce in a very attractive location. On our eastern boundary, there is a highway, a railway line, and an almost empty natural gas pipeline. We are zoned heavy industrial. The land is already cleared. Cultural heritage management agreement is already in place, no native title. The environmental approvals are pretty straightforward. So that is a perfect location. You've got everything that you need. What I haven't talked about is our technical team, our team. Next slide, thank you. I've worked for many fantastic companies, including Alcoa, BHP, and Rio Tinto, and I've worked with some very good people, but I've never had the privilege of working with such a high quality, highly experienced, capable team. You only get people of this caliber by having a very good and a very attractive project. People with this experience and background sometimes don't like working for some of the companies that I've worked with in the past. You know, they want to be able to utilize their experience and capability to the full extent. So this team of people recognize that this is a relatively low risk project coming on board at the right time with the right technology at the right time in the market. Not shown here are two of our ExCo members, our CFO, and our General Manager of Corporate Development, both of whom have got decades of experience in the resources sector, getting projects up and running. Onto our project timeline. Next slide. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned before, our pilot plant was concluded successfully earlier this year, completed in May. Our project approvals are underway. We commenced that late last year. Now, we have, in relation to approvals, we have no mine, no native title, no process influence, no tailings. So approvals, we have no worries, as an Australian would say. So approvals we expect to be in place by the end of this year. We started a feasibility study with the Tier 1 engineering partner, Hatch, and that feasibility study will be complete early next year, and that will deliver a +10, -15% capital estimate. Now, we're fast tracking that feasibility study. Now, as an investor, when you hear somebody say fast tracking, you should panic, because what normally happens is people cut corners, cut costs, and beat up their engineering partner who rolls over and plays dead. We're fast tracking by spending a lot more money on this feasibility study than a normal junior would spend. And we're doing that so that we can undertake activities that wouldn't normally be done in a feasibility study. So we've got very early engagement with vendors and equipment suppliers. We have got detailed engineering commencing early, and we'll be ordering long lead time equipment early. So we fast track the entire process so that we, at the end of the feasibility study, we don't demobilize and then start all that stuff. At the end of the feasibility study, we continue, so we don't have to remobilize and re-engage the key engineering partners. We're appointing a debt advisor next month, and we aim to have that debt processes all sorted out by early next year for construction starting just before the middle of the year. 18-month construction and commissioning with first production by the end of the year. So next slide on the corporate overview. A year ago, our market cap was around about 13 million, and we had a good feasibility study, which was the culmination of a couple of years of very good work. Our progressive growth through since then, up to the current market cap of a couple of $100 million, hasn't been by razzmatazz, but by progressive box ticking. So we said we'd develop a draft ore supply agreement, tick. Non-binding MOUs, tick. Starting our approvals process, tick. Completing pilot plant runs successfully, tick. Producing on-spec product, tick. Building a top-class team, another tick. Developing a DFS with a top Tier 1 engineering partner, tick. Raising capital, tick. Developing binding offtakes, tick. These are all things we said we'd do and did. Getting partner investment, another tick. So our growth shows that when you do what you say you are going to do, the market recognizes and rewards it. And we're just continuing the ticking. And the next ticks will be to finalize the DFS, the approvals, start the funding process. More ticks that we're planning on. So last slide, just wrapping up. So just wrapping up and summarizing. So we have tier 1 mines from a safe jurisdiction. They've been operating for decades, importing into Townsville, where that ore's gone for many decades before, into a great location with a great process and a great team of people. And importantly, the sustainability credentials are very, very hard to beat. And of course, the thing we don't control is the market. And frankly, you couldn't ask for a luckier time to be doing this project, but I would rather be lucky than clever. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. You make your own luck. Congratulations on a great Australian story. A couple of questions here. What agreements do you have to guarantee the supply of ore from New Caledonia?
So we have 3 draft agreements with 3 different miners, SMGM, SMT, and also with Eramet. There are 6 miners over there. They are the 3 biggest ones, I believe. And my predecessor, who's an executive director, worked over there with those miners, and we just piggybacked on existing previous agreements that Queensland Nickel had. So that's pretty safe jurisdiction. Very much relationship based. That's very important. I neglected to mention that POSCO are a very large ore miner in their own right in New Caledonia. We haven't had discussions with them about that, but that's also another option. The good thing, and it's a very good question, is New Caledonia produces a lot of ore, but it tends to be the bottom half of the ore body, the saprolite, which goes into pyrometallurgical processing. The top half is almost like a waste product. The only home for it is high pressure acid leach, and that's sort of out of love at the moment. So we're actually coming along. We could take either the top half, the limonite, or the bottom half, the saprolite. But what we're doing is we're actually manna from heaven for these guys, because currently they're high grade limonite ore. They don't have a home for it, and we're coming along and saying, here we are.
Now, Magnus Energy Technologies is also building a plant up there. Have you had conversations about supplying raw materials to them?
So the Magnus project, if that goes ahead, they will be importing their precursor cathode active material. We will be producing the nickel and cobalt sulfate, which goes into the manufacture of the precursor cathode active material. So there's a one-step gap between us. So unfortunately, there's a gulf between us. We have had chats with them about some potential other synergies around services and so forth. But in terms of the supply chain, until there's somebody who's going to be producing PCAM from our material, there's no synergy there. Our plant layout is designed so that we could build a second train, and that would be large enough to support a PCAM manufacturer on that site. But that's getting ahead of ourselves.
And then there's kind of a technical question here. I know we've got a couple of analysts online. The D&I process that you're using as a low carbon footprint, it's quick, less wasteful, no tailing dam is required. Now, with regards to battery performance, how does your class 2 nickel product compare, and where does it sit on the cost curve?
So it's a class 1 nickel product. It's just high purity nickel and cobalt sulfate, the same as anyone else produces, however they're producing it. So it's the 3 ppm of iron, and the 2 ppm of this, and the 20 ppm of cobalt in the nickel, and so forth. So it's just the high purity feedstock. So it's exactly the same as nickel and cobalt sulfate produced by BHP in WA or Terrafame in Finland. It's no different.
Sure. A question here also, is the conversation with Samsung SDI still going on?
Yes. In fact, we had discussions with them last week. We didn't sign the binding offtake with them. It's you go with the people who you speak to first. But listen, Samsung are a great partner, and they made contact with us for further discussions next week. Obviously, we've still got some production that's not spoken for. Whether we want to lock that up with a binding offtake or not will depend upon our investors. We'll take guidance from them about how that should be treated. But Samsung are certainly still a valuable partner, and we're in discussions with them.